baby cried for the first time, and then a gun went off. Inside one of Mumbai's most respected hospitals, on a night that began with prayers and photographs and tears of joy, everything collapsed in a matter of seconds. The maternity floor that had been filled with the warmth of a new life was suddenly silenced by something no hospital wall is ever built to contain. Two young people had walked into that building as husband and wife, as new parents, as a family just beginning. Only one of them would ever leave alive, and that was the child who had not yet taken 10 breaths. This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about what happens when pressure, silence, and pain are left to grow in the dark. It is a story about a young woman from a loving Indian family, a young man far from everything familiar, and a single night that turned celebration into irreversible loss. And it begins the way most tragedies do, not with warning sirens but with smiles. If stories like this move you, if you believe that every victim deserves to be remembered and every truth deserves to be told, subscribe to Exposed True Crime Stories. We bring light to the darkest corners so that no life is forgotten in silence. Her name was Nandita Suresh Iyer, 25 years old, born and raised in Pune, Maharashtra, in a household that valued warmth, education, and family above everything else. Her mother had always said that Nandita could light up a room simply by entering it. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who called to check in, who sent voice notes just to say she was thinking of you. She had grown up surrounded by festivals, by the smell of her grandmother's cooking, by the sound of prayers in the early morning. Her childhood was not perfect, no childhood is, but it was rooted in love. And Nandita carried that love into every room she entered. By 25, she had built a life that reflected everything her family had hoped for her. She was educated, gentle, deeply devoted to those she held close. And when she discovered she was pregnant with her first child, the news rippled through her family like light through water. There were video calls. There were tears. There were hands pressed together in gratitude. Nandita was going to be a mother. His name was Faisal Nasser Al-Hamadi, 21 years old, born and raised in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, in a family that carried the values of honor, responsibility, and pride. He had come to India with ambition in his eyes and the restlessness of a young man still searching for his place in the world. At 21, Faisal was still becoming. He was learning what it meant to be a husband. He was learning what it meant to be far from home. And now, overnight, he was being asked to learn what it meant to be a father. Those who knew him described him as someone who felt things deeply, sometimes too deeply. Someone who carried pressure quietly rather than sharing it. In the culture he came from, strength meant endurance. It meant not bending. And so whatever he was carrying in the weeks and months before that night, he carried it alone. That silence, that inward weight, it is not an excuse for what followed. Nothing is. But it is part of understanding how a young man who had stood in a hospital room holding his newborn child could, within hours, make a choice that destroyed everything. March the 7th, 2026. The morning began the way it was supposed to. Nandita's family had been sending messages since dawn. There were flower emojis, there were prayers typed in Marathi and Hindi, there were voice notes from aunts and cousins who could not be at the hospital in person. Faisal had been by her side through the hours of labor. He had held her hand. He had spoken quietly to her in the way only a husband can. And when the doctors placed the baby into their arms for the first time, there was a moment, however brief, where the world seemed to hold its breath in the most beautiful way. Photographs were taken, the kind that become framed memories. No one looking at those photographs would have seen anything other than two young parents at the beginning of their story. That is the cruelty of what followed. Because the morning told one story, and the night told another. Breach Candy Hospital in Mumbai is known for its care, its history, its dedication to the families it serves. The maternity floor on the evening of March the 7th was, by all accounts, quiet, routine. The soft footsteps of nurses, the gentle hum of monitors, the low murmur of families speaking in hushed, grateful tones. At 9:17 in the evening, that quiet was broken. Staff would later say they heard what sounded like something heavy falling. Then another sound. Then another. Someone called for security. A code alert was announced through the intercom. Nurses moved quickly, pulling doors closed, checking on patients, trying to understand what was happening. By the time officers arrived at Breach Candy Hospital, the scene inside that maternity room had already told its story. Nandita Suresh Iyer, 25 years old, was gone. Faisal Nasser Al-Hamadi, 21 years old, was gone. The newborn was alive, unharmed, breathing, and everything else had changed forever. In the hours and days that followed, investigators confirmed what witnesses had already begun to fear. Authorities stated that Faisal had shot Nandita before turning the weapon on himself. No other patients were injured. The hospital was placed on lockdown. It was eventually lifted, but the emotional lockdown, the one that settled over the nursing staff, over Nandita's family, over the entire community that learned of what had happened, that one did not lift so easily. And the questions began. Why? What could have pushed a young man to such an irreversible point on the very night his child entered the world? Was there an argument? Had something been said? Had something been building for weeks, for months, that no one outside that relationship had been allowed to see? Authorities have not released a confirmed motive. No note was made public. No documented history of disturbances at the hospital that evening has been confirmed. And when the answers are absent, the grief becomes heavier, because there is nowhere to place it. There is a conversation that rarely gets spoken out loud, and it is this one. Becoming a parent is one of the most emotionally overwhelming thresholds a person will ever cross. It does not matter how much you wanted it, how long you waited for it, how deeply you love the person beside you. The moment a child arrives, everything shifts. Identity changes. Financial reality sharpens. Responsibility becomes immediate and permanent. Sleep disappears. And whatever cracks existed in a relationship before that moment, they do not heal under that pressure. They widen. Faisal was 21. He was far from his family in Dubai. He was far from the language he grew up in, the food he knew, the support systems that shape a person's sense of steadiness. He was a young man in an unfamiliar city, in an unfamiliar hospital, holding a child he was now entirely responsible for. None of that excuses violence. Nothing does. But experts who study domestic tragedy during the perinatal period, the months surrounding birth, consistently note that this is one of the most emotionally volatile windows in a couple's life together. Existing instability does not dissolve when a baby arrives. It intensifies. Pressure does not always announce itself. It does not leave visible marks. It grows quietly behind closed doors until it finds the only way out it knows. One of the first questions the community raised, and rightfully so, was this: how did a firearm enter a hospital? Breach Candy Hospital, like most hospitals across India, relies on visitor registration, security personnel, and controlled access rather than the kind of screening found at airports or government buildings. After this tragedy, voices from across Mumbai began asking whether that was enough. Should maternity wards have stricter access policies? Should screening at hospital entrances be more rigorous? Should there be specialized support, counseling, social workers, mental health check-ins for couples in the immediate hours after birth? These are not simple questions, and they do not have simple answers, because even the most thorough security system cannot always detect a private crisis, cannot see inside a relationship. It cannot measure the weight a person has been carrying in silence for months. Domestic violence remains one of the leading causes of death among women in their reproductive years, across every country, every culture, every community. India is not exempt from this truth. The UAE is not exempt. No country is. What happened inside that room at Breach Candy Hospital on the 7th of March was not an isolated incident that came from nowhere. It was the visible end of something that had been invisible for far too long. At the center of this story, beyond the investigation, beyond the headlines, beyond the questions about security and motive and prevention, there is a child who drew their first breath in a room full of joy, a child who, before they were old enough to understand any of it, lost both parents within hours of being born. Out of respect for the privacy of the family, detailed arrangements around the child's care have not been made public, and they should remain private. because that child deserves a life that is not defined by the worst night their parents ever experienced. Nandita's family, her mother, her father, the aunts and cousins who had been sending prayers all morning, they are now carrying a grief that has no language. The loss of a daughter, the loss of a grandchild's future as it was meant to be, the bewilderment of a day that held so much promise. And somewhere, Faisal's family in Dubai received a phone call that no parent should ever receive. 2 families, 2 countries, 1 child, and a silence where celebration should have been. When something ends in seconds, it almost never began there. The final moment is never the beginning. It is the breaking point. And the most heartbreaking truth about cases like this is how ordinary the morning looked from the outside. There were no warning signs in the hallway. There were no public arguments. There was no moment where anyone watching would have thought, something is wrong here. There was just a young couple, a new baby, a hospital room full of photographs and warmth. And somewhere beneath that surface, something was breaking. That is the truth that cases like Nandita's demand we hold. Not just the tragedy itself, but the silence that preceded it. The pressure that went unnamed. The conversations that never happened. The help that was never asked for and never offered. If you are in a relationship where pressure has become pain, speak. Find someone who will listen. The systems are imperfect, yes, but silence is always more dangerous than reaching out. And if you know someone who is carrying something heavy, ask them. Not once. Ask them again. Because the most devastating truths are rarely loud. They grow quietly in the dark, behind closed doors, until one irreversible moment changes everything. By the time the rest of the world hears about it, the damage is already done. Nandita Suresh Iyer was 25 years old. She was a daughter, a wife, a new mother, and a light in every room she entered. She deserved to bring her child home. She deserved more time. If this story moved you, if you believe that every victim deserves a voice and every truth deserves to be told, subscribe to Exposed True Crime Stories. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because awareness is not just information. It is the first step toward prevention. We will keep telling these stories, so that lives like Nandita's are never forgotten.